Thank you. So, as everybody else is saying, thanks very much to Jane and the team for organising another great event. This is my second time at the mHealth conference, and it's always good fun. And I know a couple of the guys from the Ulster team who are up as well had a good night last night too. So, I'll not talk about that though. So I'm going to talk mostly about one of the projects that we've been working on, which is around risk reduction for developing Alzheimer's disease in later life. So it's a middle age intervention. But before I started that, I'd just like to give an overview of kind of the group that I'm from. So you may have seen from the bio that I'm from the Connected Health Innovation Centre at Ulster, and that's led by Professor Chris Nugent and Professor Jim McLaughlin at the university from a computing and an engineering point of view. And the centre was funded by our local body InvestNI, 5 million over 5 years to stimulate growth of connected health in Northern Ireland. So what we try to do is work with local industry and local companies in the north to develop new products, new services, and better understand the information and the data that these companies are generating in the area of connected health. We have a fairly large team, about 12 full-time researchers at the moment, and we're currently recruiting for some more, and about 25 projects, just over 25 projects that we have been through to date. So a really exciting project covering a range of different company involvement. So we have technology companies, software companies, care home, domiciliary care providers, and charities as well, so Alzheimer's Society, Diabetes UK, and those sorts of companies involved too. So a really interesting mix, and we try to put together small consortia of these companies and then work with them to impart some knowledge from an academic perspective into their products. These are some examples of some of the projects that we've worked on. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus mostly on our work on dementia today, but just to give you a flavour for the types of things that we do a lot around activity recognition. So we're working with James Leckie Design to try to put some intelligence into the mobility aids that they create for children with disability. We're working on medication management. I've seen lots of themes around medication management in the previous talks today. So we're working with quite an innovative community pharmacy in Ballymena, which is just north of Belfast, to look at how we can support people with domiciliary care in a domiciliary care environment to have better medicine optimization. Thermal imaging as well. We do a lot of thermal imaging and tracking people in the environment. So if anybody wants any information on what we could offer through Chic or any of the other projects, please just let me know after the presentation. So that's really a brief overview of what Chic does. When I look more at from an academic point of view, these are all the titles of our publications put into a word cloud, and you'll see some words coming out like technology, dementia, apps, activity being a big part of that. So we like to try to understand the types of activity that people do inside of an environment. Machine learning, classification systems as well. So that gives you a feel for the types of work that we typically do within the research group at Ulster. And a big clinical part of our work is around dementia, as was mentioned there. So we try to apply these technologies to support people to live more independently for longer at home. And typically that would be around reminding and prompting, so trying to prompt people to complete activities of daily living or to go to their appointment or to leave the bin out. And Jane mentioned the Remind project that we're collaborating with NUIG on, which is looking specifically at that. But as we've progressed through that learning and that understanding, we've found kind of a new area within dementia research to focus on, and that's around risk reduction. So we'll all know about the global impact of dementia and the cost that it has, and it's really one of the big global challenges at the minute to try to better manage and reduce the cost of caring for people with dementia. Huge amount of numbers of people being diagnosed daily, and obviously a huge cost as well. And the sad thing is that given all the effort that's going into this, we still have no viable cure. So although there's some drugs that are showing promise, we still have yet to identify a cure for this. And because of that, really a lot of the research is focusing to try to identify and to adapt these modifiable risk factors so that we can prevent the onset of dementia, or at least reduce the risk of somebody developing dementia in later life. And that's really where this project focuses in. So the project's called Grey Matters, and we wanted to try to specifically target these modifiable behavioural risk factors. So it's been shown that around a third of Alzheimer's disease can be attributed to these sorts of risk factors. And also that what's good for the heart is also good for the brain. So we've seen by targeting these sorts of risk factors for cardiovascular disease that we can reduce somebody's risk of developing that, and we're beginning to find that that's the same for the brain as well, or for dementia. So when we think about those sorts of risk factors, it's typically things like increasing physical activity, eating healthier, improving quality of sleep, becoming more socially active, trying to reduce your stress, and also do more cognitively stimulating activities. And then obviously the bad sort of activities as well, so reducing alcohol consumption, which some of my Ulster colleagues could take on board from last night, and also reducing smoking as well. So it's really a multi-domain sort of approach. So we're trying to target all of these lifestyle factors that influence the onset of dementia, or can increase your risk of developing dementia in later life. So this is an overview. It was basically an app intervention. The app itself showed some educational content that we created from viable sources. So our colleagues at Utah State University, who I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, created these facts and suggestion pairs. They were pushed to the person on a daily basis, and you could schedule those depending on when you felt that you would like to receive them. And then they also filled in these 12 different questions that covered those 6 domains. Across the 6 behavioural domains that we were interested in. And we collected all of that information and then provided feedback on how people were meeting CDC recommended guidelines across these 6 domains. So that you should eat 5 pieces of fruit and vegetables, for example, on a daily basis. And we provided some feedback to them through the mobile phone interface. And the whole idea, as I keep saying, is to lessen the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by getting people to better knowledge about how these behavioural traits impact the risk of developing dementia, and also trying to get them to understand what they're doing badly and what they could improve on, so some intrinsic motivation to change there as well. And you may be thinking, oh no, here we go, just another app. There's hundreds of thousands of these sorts of apps available on Google Play or the App Store. And what really makes these sort of difference, and I've heard Jane really opened with these sorts of statements when we started the conference today. So these apps are typically, when we look at them broadly across healthcare, limited in terms of quality and accuracy of the information that they send to these individuals. And a lot of them also aren't underpinned by sort of theoretical behaviour change techniques as well. And don't have good standards behind them, both in terms of how they're developed, so security standards, but also that they've been vetted and validated, that they won't have a bad impact on the person that's using them. So you may be thinking, okay, Grey Matters is maybe just another one of these sorts of apps, but we've worked quite hard to develop something that is scientifically backed, and we're working even harder to validate that that's been correct. So I wanted to talk today about the steps that we've taken to really make sure that we don't fall into this trap of these other 100,000 medical apps out there that they get this bad rep. And how we started that was really, we've heard this time and time again throughout today, is to develop a multidisciplinary team, but also an intersectoral team as well. So we had a very strong technical team. Professor Chris Nugent, who I already mentioned, leads the group. Sally McLean, who's from a statistics background. And then myself and Philip worked more from a technical perspective on developing the app itself. But the underpinning of actually what the app looked like, the functionality that it had, and also the facts and suggestions that it pushed to people came from our clinical team at Utah State University. Maria Norton and, that's Joanne Touchange from Utah as well. I've put Maria twice, she'll like that. And they've basically worked to look at epidemiology of dementia across 15 years. So they worked on a big study called the Cache County Study for Memory and Aging that tracked these people over 15 years and took cognitive assessments throughout that time to look at what risk factors were associated then with cognitive decline. So it's really underpinned quite strongly by this clinical research. And then Cristiano on the end is kind of our business guru. So he helped us he is currently helping us to try to make sure that the standards of our software are good enough to make it commercially viable, so that we could send it out to the public and it would be robust and follow all the security principles as well. So yeah, I think intersectoral is just as important. So we need to work with business as well, charities and such, as well as being multidisciplinary. So I already mentioned that our clinical team were heavily influenced in the design of this, and a lot of apps don't really follow these sort of underpinning from a behaviour change point of view. Grey Matters was based on the trans-theoretical model of behaviour change. Now, I can just about pronounce that, so don't ask me the nuts and bolts of what it follows. Actually, Jane and her team provided us with a nice workshop yesterday on behaviour change techniques, so we're slowly trying to learn what all these words mean and how we can better implement it in our software. But the clinical team basically identified this behaviour change technique for us to implement then in our solution. And we worked hard to identify basically how we could give people that understanding of how they could change these behaviours to lessen the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in later life. So I think having this sort of underpinning behind it is essential basically to these being effective in the long term. The second thing, so where Cristiano really comes in, is about design and the interaction of the solution. So we piloted the app itself, which I'll talk about later on, and then we've subsequently been refining how the interaction of the solution works. So in this case, obviously we had 12 questions for somebody to fill in every single day, and that can become quite burdensome. So we worked very hard to make that interaction as easy as possible. And we wanted to get down to about 2 minutes, so it took somebody 2 minutes to fill in these questions on a daily basis. And I think that interaction led to quite high response times, which I'll show when we talk about the results later on. But I think design is key, both from an interaction point of view, but also when somebody downloads this app, they think it's a commercial app and not something that's from research. So as I already said, there's hundreds of thousands of apps out there, and you don't want somebody thinking, oh, this is rubbish. Look at the graphics on it, and I don't want to use it. So we need to make sure the design of these apps is up to scratch in terms of what's happening in industry, which is again where our intersectoral comes into play. The other thing that we did, which was kind of interesting as well, so we developed our application. We put our content into it, and then we wanted to ensure that the app was up to scratch in terms of the content that was inside. So before we went to pilot, we actually went through a peer review process, and I think Jane was maybe involved in some of this work by our PhD student Philip Harton at Ulster. So Philip basically got 5 experts to review both the content of the app, the interaction, the functionality and the aesthetics, using what was called the MARS scale, which is a mobile assessment tool, which is coming out of the literature. About 2015 it was released, and it's quite a nice tool for assessing whether your app would be functional and how it compares against other apps. So we compared Grey Matters against some other applications that were out there targeting different behaviours, so drinking more water, for example, or stopping smoking, or eating more fruit and veg. Just to see how it kind of stacked up in terms of its authenticity of the content and also its design. And it came out really highly scored compared to the other products that are on the market, and that would be understandable given the amount of resource that we put behind and the science that we put behind it. And I think this is an important step. If you are going to create an app, and before trialing it, just have a second thought. Send it to somebody who's not related to the project, get them to evaluate whether the content is correct and whether it functions as it should. I think this is a great step to take before going to a larger scale pilot. And that's exactly what we did. So as I said, we tried to evaluate the app in Utah. So we had 146 participants in ages between 40 to 64. And we assigned 104 of those people to the treatment group, so they received the app. They also got some booster events as well, like cookery classes, yoga classes, that sort of thing. And we trialled it over 6 months with them. It consisted of the older version of the app before it got redesigned, and a Nike Fuel Band for them to track their activity. And they reported every day across those 6 behaviour domains, 12 questions. And the results were pretty overwhelmingly positive. So we've seen everybody who used the app showed adoption of new healthy behaviours. So we've seen trends across all of the 6 domains or positive trends in all of the 6 domains. Importantly, we've seen intrinsic motivation to change, decrease in about their memory concerns as well. And then when we look more at clinical measures, we've seen increase in good cholesterol and also decreases in BMI over that 6-month period. The other interesting thing was that we've seen the more that somebody launched the app, the greater those changes were. And the people who used the app every day seen the largest amount of changes. So we actually seen an association with people who became more involved with the application and clinical outcomes in terms of reduction of BMI, as shown by the bottom graph there. As well as that, when we think about some testimonials, we had quite good feedback from our users as well. So these are just 2 sort of examples. And it really got people to start to think about the behaviours that we were targeting. So people tried to use it every day if they could, and it also made them think about what they were doing with these behaviours and how they could change them to better impact or reduce the risk of dementia. So really, really interesting results, both from what we can measure and also about interactions from the users with the results as well. The staggering thing was, though, we had really high responses, so around about 400, 500 responses every day from our participants. I think our average was about 94%, so 94% of users logged into the app every day, either to review the factoid or to provide us with our 12 questions. And it went along throughout our study pretty steadily until about 2 weeks before the end, when we told everybody that the study was going to end. And then we've seen this huge dropout of interaction with the application. So everybody was obviously just going along because we were asking them to stay engaged with the application. And then when they thought it was coming to an end, suddenly we've seen this huge, sharp decline in the amount of interaction that people were giving us through the app. And this is really one of the big problems that we're starting to target and come across within our research. So how do we get people to sustain and maintain these healthy behaviours over time? So it's okay that maybe they are keeping up with the activities, but we don't know as researchers because they're not engaged with the app itself. So how can we keep them engaged with the intervention, the mobile intervention? So that leads us on to kind of some of the future work that we're working on at the minute at Ulster. And these are some of the topics that we're trying to integrate into what we're calling our virtual personal coach. So we're trying to have more intelligent prompting, so the ability to understand when somebody's going to drop out or when they need an additional prompt from the system, and both in terms of context from an activity recognition point of view, but also from a behaviour change point of view as well. We want to try to improve our education and particularly the stratification of our education, so being able to tailor educational content based on the user themselves. Unobtrusive monitoring, quite a big part, so you'll potentially have seen some posters that try to do some unobtrusive or opportunistic sensing to detect these sorts of parameters that we're interested in from a behavioural point of view. And then persuasive and effective computing, and then to understand the emotions of the user so that we can, again, tailor the educational content to make it more appealable to the person themselves. So you don't want to be shouting at somebody if they're depressed at the minute, and maybe you try a different technique to try to engage with them to make the prompt more effective. And we're hoping that these sorts of changes to make the app more intelligent, basically, will lead to better sustainment of engagement with the technology itself. So some of the areas of research then, I've touched on these already. So we're trying to look at opportunistic and participatory ways of sensing. So traditionally we relied heavily on self-report in this study. We're looking at new ways that we can try to get this information without having to continually ask the person to fill in these 12 questions. And that's really through data aggregation, data fusion, and intelligent data analytics. So how can we mine the data that we've got from grey matters already to understand and profile these sorts of users? And then on the farther end, we're looking at how we can improve the behaviour change techniques within grey matters, and also how we can model adoption of the system as well, which I'll talk a little bit about now. So from an unobtrusive sensing point of view, this comes a little bit outside grey matters, but I guess a lot of the learning that we've had from the project is feeding into this, and Federico is here from the Crossing project. Federico's doing his PhD on opportunistic sensing to try to get older adults more physically active, and I think we can learn a lot from grey matters and bring it into this sort of system. So he's trying to understand basically what we can learn in terms of social engagement, in terms of the activity that people are trying to do through wearables and mobile devices, and also sensors in the environment, and then combine that with multimodal interfaces. So anybody, Amazon Alexa? Anybody tried it? Yeah, a few people? Okay, yeah. Do you shout at yours as much as I do, John? Yeah, it's the Northern Irish accent. I don't think I can understand it. But we're looking at how we can use that to both ask questions to the user, but also provide feedback as well. So, Alexa's broken, just like it does at home. But yeah, just to provide some feedback to the user in a more natural and intuitive way. So if you want to speak more about this sort of work, I guess you ask Federico, because he's the expert on it at the minute. From a prompting point of view then, we're trying to do more opportunistic sensing, so using sensors on the mobile device itself in terms of accelerometry, the light sensor, GPS, to understand the context around when and where people are more likely to answer prompts and reminders. So this is from the Remind project. So if we can understand when they're most likely to acknowledge, we can then target those reminders or prompts at that most appropriate time to try to get better engagement then with our solution. And the last one really is about technology adoption, so adoption of these sorts of solutions, and we've had another great project with our colleagues at Utah State University to look at this. So we try to profile the types of people that do or do not engage with these sorts of solutions. So in this case, this project was called Technology Adoption and Usage Tool, or TOT. We took health information from the CCSMA that I talked about earlier and combined it with another large database from the UPDB, which is the Utah Population Database, which has information on health records, but also driver's licenses and demographic information. And we combined that with usage from an app, a reminder app that we were trialing with these people, to try to understand the types of people that do or do not engage with the solution over longer periods of time. And we've been able to quite successfully, using basically health parameters like if you suffered from hypertension, how often you visit your doctor, do you have a driver's license, do you live alone, are you divorced, those sorts of metrics. We've been able to basically model with about 80 to 90% accuracy an adopter versus a non-adopter. So using this sort of approach, we're hoping to be able to take that away from reminders and into a different domain like our grey matter study, or perhaps a different cohort altogether. In particular, we're looking at the mPower study, which is Parkinson's disease, which collected similar sort of information. So can we take what we've learned here with reminders and people with dementia and apply that to a different domain? So that was quite a whirlwind of some of the learnings that we've had from grey matters. I just wanted to kind of finish with some messages to two different types of researcher, I guess. So as I said, I'm not a behavioural scientist, but we have learned quite a lot from a behavioural point of view, particularly around how technology can be used within these sorts of interventions. So basically, without the app and grey matters, we wouldn't have been able to collect the richness of information that we got in terms of these 12 questions pretty much every day for 6 months. So the smartphone really does open up new ways to both engage and collect information from our user. But it's very, very important to tailor the intervention, both in terms of the population that they're dealing with, but also the cultural background as well. So our study in Utah was obviously quite influenced by the church, the Mormon church in around Utah, which is why we didn't tackle smoking and drinking behaviour. But we would need to tailor that then for a different intervention in a different population. And then if anybody is looking at risk reduction for dementia, we would really recommend a multi-domain intervention rather than trying to target one particular area, as we found that could potentially be more effective in reducing this error. And then from a technology point of view, I guess we've kind of learned that technology isn't always the answer, it's the question. So is technology the effective tool to use for these sorts of intervention? And how can we better understand if it's effective and how we can improve its effectiveness? And that's really through, as I've already talked about, engagement with a multidisciplinary team to really guide how those trials are set up, what we should measure, and also how we can take that further then into commercialisation. So that's everything for me.